Baldwin didn't serve, and yet he very much belongs to the GI Bill generation. When the soldiers came back from World War I, black soldiers came back from World War I, they were kind of forced back into the place where blacks had to be. Lynching was rampant in the United States before the Roaring '20s. Congress couldn't pass an anti-lynching bill. And in 1919, terrible race riots broke out across the country, having to do with competition between black and white workers in the North. Because one of the things that had happened during World War I was that with no immigration from Europe, the factories of the North and the Midwest needed workers. So they began to recruit among black agricultural workers in the South. This was very dangerous business. Sometimes the recruiters were attacked by white plantation owners. In 2 cases, they were killed. But nevertheless, the Great Migration was on. Black people were leaving the South in droves. Often men would answer one of the reasons for going was to protect their families. Down south, they couldn't protect their daughters, their wives, or even their sons from false accusations and things like that. So when the soldiers came back from World War II, the memory of what had happened to their fathers was with them, and they were determined that it not happen again. And so Baldwin shared in that kind of anger, that being fed up, and he wasn't going to do it. And in one of his greatest essays, Notes of a Native Son, which is one of the great American essays, we have the essence of Baldwin, really. The journey out of Egypt was his great theme, and it wasn't always a physical place, not always the ghetto or prison, but also the trap of your mind, of what you had been led to believe or made to think or left with as the only conclusion to draw. In this essay, he somehow marries the circumstances of his own flight, the death of his tyrannical father, and the outburst of a riot in Harlem together in this narration. And his style comes forward. He had the most lyrical vocabulary about very difficult experiences, which had the effect of making you think about them in a different way, but also feel as though you'd met them for the first time. He wasn't the first person to write about the ghetto or lack of opportunity, but there hadn't been this very personal language before, and also his vulnerability, because black men had throughout American history been described as weak or clownish or irresponsible or stupid. In prose or in print, black men tended to maintain a very rigorous front. There's no way you could call W.E.B. Du Bois a man of the people, even though black people were his subject. Black history was his passion. But he wrote as someone who had a lot to prove, or his image, or his bearing. And his prose has a very 19th century elevated way about it. The great sociologists of the 30s, writing about Negro problems, they were very earnest, they were very clear. But there hadn't, and Richard Wright in Black Boy, one of the most haunting books in American literature, had his sort of way, but it was still very different from something that Baldwin offered, which was strange that he could bring poetry from these bleak occurrences and this bleak background, but he did. And this poetry was a kind of personal salvation. He wrote at a time when Marxism was losing its influence, especially after the war, and psychoanalysis was sort of gaining as a way of interpreting culture, our encounters with culture. And so in a way, he was already prepared for that because his writing was so personal and so interior, and yet open. You were allowed to visit, not allowed to visit, that's not quite the right word. To read something by Baldwin is like opening a door or lifting a lid, and the story is going on. It's going on, and if you close it, it would still sort of be going on. There's something about it that's very like a performance. I think it's because that as literary as he was, his writing never lost a speakerly quality, that there is a human being behind these words or at the end of these words, which tended to reinforce the underlying assumption of his work, which is that history is man-made. It's full of choices. It's full of personal responsibilities. We are not victims of the forces of history. We are, in a way, what directs it or what can change it. So Notes of a Native Son certainly established his reputation, and he was much sought after as an essayist who would say the unexpected thing, including denouncing Richard Wright and the protest tradition. The interesting thing about James Baldwin is that though he had Count Cullen as a French teacher when he was in junior high school, the Harlem Renaissance does not impinge on his consciousness in the least as a young person. He's not thinking of Harlem and its cultural heydays. He doesn't go around saying this is where the Cotton Club used to be, or Aaliyah Walker lived there, or Langston Hughes lived there. He knew all this, but it doesn't enter into what he's talking about. Harlem has, in his writing, its very sort of modern cinematic look, which is as an overcrowded slum. And he was not sentimental about it in any way. And so his going to France was something he took as an example from Richard Wright, who, married to a Jewish woman, had to get out. Baldwin went to France for the sort of the same reasons, that I have to get out. It was after World War I when black people began to think of Europe as a kind of a personal haven or retreat. It was understood as the individual solution to a mass problem. Everyone knew that there were the French Empire and the British Empire, but London and Paris was where an American black could maybe escape Jim Crow or the American social dictates of what black meant. Expatriatism was for a long time an uncomfortable thing, a bit like passing. Everyone understood why someone may want to pass. No one denounced anyone for passing. There are no examples of black people exposing someone for being black who's pretending to be white. It was understood as that's that person's decision, but I'm sort of not going to do it. So Baldwin went to France. And I think he went also for sexual liberation, one could say. He wrote only 2 essays about sexuality, and he wasn't really interested in homosexuality. He was interested in male sexuality. And for him, the lines were always sort of blurred and fluid, and he wasn't interested really in categories. He was interested in taking categories apart. So he went to France and was very poor and found a great love, and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote. And everything from this period is rather extraordinary because not only had no one written these things in quite this way, it's because Baldwin had never sort of brought his mind to bear on these subjects before. Stranger in the village, I'm alone in a Swiss village. Here are these children reacting to me. What is that like? Things of that nature. And then, as I said, in the late 50s, the news from home began to impinge on his mind, and he couldn't take sort of being away anymore, and went south to look at Little Rock, and he met Medgar Evers, and he went to the demonstrations, and he was at the March on Washington, where he got absolutely bombed, by the way. got completely drunk, and afterwards running around at a party and hugging everyone. And Catherine and Hannah Arendt said, "Who is that?" Anyway, he was just a sort of, very present kind of person. But then, starting with the assassination of Malcolm X, which shocked shocked everyone, and Medgar Evers in '63, and the church bombing of the 4 girls in Alabama in '63 as well. These were reactions to the March on Washington. Things turned a little dark, and he became less festive himself about what was going on. You have to remember, at the time, there had not been this black presence in the streets before, not in these numbers. And there also was happening at this time a sort of revolution in black consciousness, in some ways described and heralded by Baldwin's essays. Also, he was a star already. He'd been on television, on the radio, and published everywhere, and had a bestseller on the New York Times list. And so he lent his authority to the movement. He was often called upon to denounce more militant people, and he wouldn't, including the Black Panthers, who made terrible fun of him. Eldridge Cleaver in Soul on Ice wrote things about him that are disgusting. But in those macho times, people kind of let it go. Baldwin forgave because he thought he understood, but he felt it was more important not to sort of stand against them, but to, not be used by, I hate to say things like the white establishment, they're such 60s words, to denounce anyone else. He was always asking the viewer, the reader himself, to examine his or her own conscience. But finally, after the death of Martin Luther King, something did give out in Baldwin, and it does show in his work. He says in No Name in the Street, "I don't believe in the lies of Western humanism anymore." His novel, Tell Me How Long the Train Been Gone, is very dour and doesn't have that belief in personal healing that his earlier novels did. It interests me that this writing, which in the 70s was written about, critics said, "Oh, he's very extreme, he's very bitter, or he can't write anymore, or he's taking the simple way out, or looking at easy solutions," that this writing speaks, these very works speak so forcefully to our time now. No Name in the Street, and If Beale Street Could Talk, and The Devil Finds Work, all that writing from the 70s interests people at the moment. It's as though we began where he ended up. I think one of the things that people sort of were uneasy with about Baldwin was not only what he was saying, but where he would say it. And so his essays and his fiction served very different purposes. His essays are really personal, but they are always social, and they're usually about race. They seem to be about race, but they're really about justice and the causes of injustice in America, and they're about American history. But his fiction puts in another self, and the gay writing you don't get in the essays, you get in the fiction. Go Tell It on the Mountain, if you can speak the language, is sort of a coded coming-of-age story of someone who is going to end up like Baldwin, so to speak. Another Country, Giovanni's Room, is a strange book because this intense lyricism about the love he had for the Swiss guy he met, whose last name I can never pronounce, Jean Habsburger, who remain his kind of, I don't know, first love ideal. The lyricism about first love, or this kind of love, in a 1950s format, which meant that you had to kill off one of the gay guys somehow. And yet, it is this very lyrical novel with this kind of pop structure. But Another Country is something different. The gay character is the one at the end who's still standing when everyone else is kind of flat out at the OK Corral. He's the one who is the agent of healing and understanding to the characters grieving for Rufus Scott, who kills himself at the beginning of the novel. And the same is true in Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, and then lastly in Just Above My Head. And Tells Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, the character is an actor who's married, but he has relations with men that his wife knows about. In Just Above My Head, the main character is dead when the novel opens, but his brother tells the story of his life as a gay gospel singer who was a beloved member of the family and of his church. The one novel that's the exception is If Beale Street Could Talk. No. Yes. Isn't that the one? Yes. If Beale Street Could Talk. And that is narrated by a young woman, 19 years old, who's pregnant, whose boyfriend is in prison. And her whole family and his family sort of join together to kind of save him from the fate of most black youth. These are discussion novels, and America has always been uneasy with discussion novels because something serious might get said. But they were sort of ahead of their time in that. And you always feel that Baldwin picks the form where he can be most himself, where he can be most fluid. He had sort of aspirations for the stage. I'm not the greatest fan of his theater work. I don't know why. I think they reflect his period, that time of being Elia Kazan's assistant in the American Playhouse Theater, that kind of thing. And he was never experimental in the theater the way he was in fiction. And he didn't have to be experimental in the essay because he was sort of a master of it. But he was always, his work is full of ideas, and he was always thinking or trying to say that people think. He wasn't afraid to have characters sit down and have a real talk. It's not something you could do easily in American fiction at the time. Even Salinger went to sort of a lot of strategies so that his characters could talk philosophy without alarming the American reader that, oh, there's an idea here rather than entertainment, that sort of thing. It often happens that a writer's reputation goes into decline after his or her death. It happens less often that a writer's reputation then comes back. Baldwin certainly has, and new audiences don't read him with that borderline in his career in their minds, that demarcation between early and late Baldwin. It was the time of his death. People talked about his early period and how wonderful and literary he was, and oh, it's too bad he went into this decline. He was embraced by black writers at the end of his life who didn't see that as a decline, but as his remaining rather brave and saying things no one else wanted to say. He could have gone on kind of repeating himself, but he didn't. He was honest about the way he felt and the despair he felt and where he thought the country had gone wrong and what he thought was happening, and he didn't see any reason to pretend. He wasn't writing to make people feel better. He was writing to make people better. Writers are much more of a piece in retrospect anyway. His nonfiction is admired because he did not compromise, and his fiction has admirers because he was willing to try to express. To understand something about life is for Baldwin's characters a form of paying their dues. Self-knowledge comes at a cost not everyone can bear. We don't complain about long novels in translation, and we are suspicious of the long novel in English because the longer it is, the more it might contain or examine. Criticisms of form, of lack of control, are sometimes a way of not liking what the book has to say overall, or of being against novels of ideas. But people discover certain Mailer novels for different reasons, and the same may be true of Baldwin's novels. What stands out in them now is his handling of characters' relations to family, church, each other, and their own hearts. I think everything he wrote is a way of saying, go ahead, throw your heart over the fence.